Welcome, everyone. Since around the year 1760, humanity has seen wave after wave of inventions. Many of these inventions can be called labor-saving devices, because instead of us humans needing to apply our own muscle power, or brain power, or persistence, many tasks can be done instead by mechanization, by automation, by algorithms, and by robots of one sort or another. That growing trend of increased labor-saving devices has been observed for a long time. Some writers, including the philosopher Bertrand Russell and the economist John Maynard Keynes, pointed out in the early 1930s that one consequence of all these inventions was that we humans should not need to labor so hard. Instead of working 8 or more hours every day of the week, we should, in principle, be able to give more of our time to leisure, or as Bertrand Russell put it, to idleness. But what's happened since the 1930s? Most people seem to continue to work just as hard as ever. Predictions of 15-hour work weeks now seem quaint. Or do they? To bring us up to date with predictions of major transformations in our work lives and in the economy, London Futurists is very fortunate to have as our speaker in this webinar, Hugh Shields. Hugh's background includes finance and economics, as well as a wide study of the progress of artificial intelligence. He recently set up a new think tank called the Centre for AI and Prosperity. So, Hugh, what are the possibilities for our children, for those who come after us, and indeed for ourselves in the decades to come? Are 15-hour work weeks on the horizon, or should we anticipate something different altogether? Welcome.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction, and good afternoon, good day, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining. Well, Boris Yeltsin was once asked, Boris, if you could describe the state of the Russian economy in one word, what would you say? And the answer came back, good. And then he was asked, well, if you had 2 words to describe the state of the Russian economy, what would you say? And the answer came back, not good. Well, artificial intelligence is a little bit like that. And the article we're going to start by discussing, which is an article by Keynes, is also at times very optimistic and at other times not so optimistic. So if we go to the next slide, David, I will just describe the agenda in summary. We're going to Keynes, the famous Cambridge economist, I'm sure most of you have heard, wrote this article. The one I have in front of me is dated 1930, called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And I'm going to walk through that essay. It's a short essay, it's very interesting. And obviously at this time, nobody was using the term artificial intelligence, but certainly you can read it in that light. We're going to reflect on where we stand today, given what Keynes had said nearly 100 years ago now. Then we're going to think about economic possibilities for our children and discuss a little bit the technological or economic singularity, which I know you've touched on many of these sessions previously. I also want to touch on other possibilities, because this, I think, goes beyond economics, and we think more broadly about our place in the world, our place in the universe. And then we'll finish with a few concluding thoughts. I'm going to aim to speak until about 4:45 or so, and then we can have some questions. We are going to touch on some very, very big themes and some big topics, so we could talk all day. I think I'd asked David if we could wrap up around 5:30. So I usually try to keep to my timings on these things. So if that's helpful to you, those are going to be the timings. So let's go then to the next slide, David, and just think about this essay, which is called These Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Keynes, in 1930, of course, he was writing against the background of severe economic depression. In 1929, as I'm sure you know, the world was going through this awful depression, or starting in 1929. And it was against that background that he wrote his general theory of employment, interest, and money, which is arguably the most famous book in academic economics. In this essay, he is looking forward, and I'll just read exactly what he said towards the bottom of the first page. He says, "My purpose in this essay is not to examine the present or the near future, but to take wings into the future. What can we reasonably expect the level of our economic life to be 100 years hence? What are the economic possibilities for our grandchildren?" Which is what gives it the title, of course. And he talks a little bit about all sorts of things, about how the UK or GB had grown, and a little bit about the history. He reflects that up until at that time, incredibly recently, humans had not really made much technological progress at all. And in fact, it was only in the very recent past, the 19th century, when we had the Industrial Revolution, when things really started to take off. And he was beginning to think, well, how are things going to go in the decades after 1930, and in particular, as I say, 100 years out? And he very quickly, he talks a little bit about population growth and other things. He doesn't think population growth is a problem. I mean, interestingly, at that time, I took a note of these things. At that time, in 1930, the UK's population was 46 million, and today it's more like 68 million. So we've grown, well, the best part of 50%. The world's population, however, has quadrupled. The world's population in 1930 was 2 billion, is now approaching 8 billion. Is population growth going to cause us problems? Well, possibly, and we have folks now interested in longevity and even wanting to live forever. Interesting topic. That might be a big problem for population growth and the capacity of Earth to handle what is going on. But anyway, he didn't really see population growth as an issue, and he quite quickly, looking at the technological improvements that he could see and projecting forward on some kind of reasonable basis, he thought, well, we're going to actually what he called solve the economic problem. And this is my second bullet here. He says that he does talk about humankind solving its economic problem, by which he means we will have, as David was explaining at the beginning, we will have lots of leisure time, and we will have reduced working weeks, and this may be a good thing. It may be a good thing, or maybe it won't be a good thing. This is the interesting topic. But he, in turns, being very optimistic about solving this economic problem, he also says this on the second page of his article: "We are being afflicted with a new disease of which some readers may not yet have heard the name, but of which they will hear a great deal in the years to come, namely technological unemployment. This means unemployment due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor." And nonetheless, he says this is a temporary phase of maladjustment. In the long run, it means that we are, or humankind is, solving its economic problem. And he predicts that the standard of living 100 years hence will be, he says, between 4 and 8 times the size it is back then in 1930. And I think he sees that as in a positive light, whilst a little bit questioning, well, what does it all mean for the ordinary worker? What does it mean for anybody in particular? And then I think he makes some interesting reflections, and he talks about human needs, because are human needs insatiable or not? And he talks about absolute needs and relative needs. So absolute needs, you may say they are our needs to subsist. So we have enough food, we've got a roof over our heads, we keep warm and so forth. Those absolute needs, he feels, can easily be satisfied for everybody. That is not going to be a challenge. When we talk about relative needs, this is where we do have a challenge. So relative needs are needs where we gain satisfaction because we've got more than someone else, and we feel good about that, and we have a sense of superiority to others. Well, He says this second class of needs, maybe that is a bit difficult to satisfy. Maybe if we talk about relative needs, maybe we never quite get there. You buy a new car and then you want the next new car, or you buy the latest iPhone, you want the next iPhone, and so it goes on. Nonetheless, he having talked about needs, he does draw the conclusion that assuming there are no important wars and there is no important increase in population, two big caveats, which of course turned out not to be true, he nonetheless said the economic problem may be solved, or at least within sight of solution, within 100 years. This means that the economic problem is not, if we look into the future, the permanent problem of the human race. So I think it's a very interesting conclusion, and we can reflect on where we think that is in a moment. And he makes this comment, which I already said, this is actually startling, because if you look back into history, at no point really previously have we ever had anyone really been able to contemplate this. What are the implications of solving this economic problem? What does it all mean? Is it a benefit to solve the economic problem? Or as he says, does it mean we can expect a general nervous breakdown? Do we need work to make ourselves feel happy and good about life? He asked these questions, and I think he very much does see that there will be this huge need for adjustment. As he puts it, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his real permanent problem: how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him or her, to live wisely and agreeably and well. And then he makes this interesting comment: yet there is no country and no people, I think, who can look forward to the age of leisure and abundance without a dread. Because he was a little bit reflecting on the leisure classes as then they were, and not that, perhaps not so many, but he didn't think they were all that happy. And they had all this leisure time, but were they using it in a way that made them content, and in a way that left them satisfied? He didn't think so. Of course, the average worker at that time in 1930, working great big long hours, if you said to them, well, instead of working all these long hours, you can do a 15-hour week, as David touched on, well, most people would think that's great. And probably 15 hours work is great compared to 40 hours work. Probably we could all think that would be good, and we've got some work and some leisure time. But is that what we're going to have, and where are we going with all of this? He then talks a little bit about love of money, and we're back to, and we talked about relative needs, but he also says, well, there are always going to be some people who just want to get richer and richer and richer and richer. And I suspect we can all point to examples of that as we talk today. But he concludes that really, if people are going to achieve contentment and be happy in some way, he says that we must return to the most sure and certain principles of religion and traditional virtue. He believes that, he says, in fact, avarice is a vice and love of money is detestable. And if we want to walk the path of virtue and wisdom, we need to think about these things differently. And then he basically stops himself in his tracks and says, the time is not yet. We are a long way off. And as we said at the beginning, we're talking about 100 years. In signing off his essay, he says, nonetheless, there will be no harm in making mild preparations for our destiny, in encouraging and experimenting in the arts of life, as well as the activities of purpose. What is going to be the purposeful existence when machines do basically everything? Now, this article in economics, in academic economics, has become incredibly famous, and various very high-profile economists have looked back on it or reconsidered at different points and have reflected, what do they think it all means right now? We might go to the next slide, David, but I'll just say a couple of things. And I'm talking now about some of the economists who've considered Keynes's article or revisited it. So somebody called Edward Phelps, well-known economist from University of Columbia, he says, talking about this, a career provides most, if not all, of the attainable self-realization in modern societies. So for him, the idea of not working would be a bad one. Somebody called Richard Friedman, who works at Harvard, he's much more, even more emphatic. He says, hard work is the only way forward. There is so much to learn and produce and improve that we should not spend more than a dribble of time living as if we were on Eden. Grandchildren, keep trucking, he says. So he doesn't think the idea of unlimited leisure is a good one. But maybe we're going to get there anyway. If we think about where we are today and we think about Keynes's article, it still feels, and I think David touched on this in his introduction, it still feels that this so-called solution to the economic problem is a way off. It still feels that we're all getting busier and busier and busier and more hectic and more meetings and more stuff to do. And our diaries are filled up with all sorts of things. And the idea of having lots of leisure seems as far off as ever. But as I say in the second bullet here, the forward march of AI and automation is relentless. And it's actually, I think, more relentless than people probably realize or probably see. We all know about the tracking that goes on various social media platforms, and suddenly you're getting offers for things that you're interested in, and you realize that somebody somewhere or some piece of some algorithm is sending things that may be of particular interest to you. So we know that AI is moving relentlessly forward, and it's the pace of it is dramatic. There are nonetheless very significant institutional and other human barriers to change. If you look at, I don't know, big accounting firms, big law firms, any firms where there are based on partnerships, they're reluctant to give up their way of life. And effectively, I think that, you know, a lot of professional, if you look at the professions, in some way, yeah, in some way they're competitive, but in some way they're actually not that competitive, because they're all copying each other to some extent or watching each other. So that it is actually, if I think about accounting, I started out life as an accountant. If I think about accounting, can accounting be done totally by a machine? Absolutely, I believe it can. I mean, accounting is a pile of rules. You can program those into a machine, and the machine can do it. Same with the law. I mean, a lot of people will say, well, what about human judgments? Well, they can be programmed into the machine as well. And in fact, you know, if a partner of a law firm or an accounting firm is asked to make a judgment, really what they're doing is trawling through their own experience of things and saying, well, given this, I think that. Well, I'm relatively optimistic that a machine can do that as well. And in fact, a machine has the advantage that we can draw on many more experiences and document them very quickly, and you know, you may get an answer very, very, very quickly as well. Does it mean right now that a machine can completely replace a human? Well, we're not quite there, but I think that in 2 to 3 decades, I find it difficult to see that we will have a world in which humans are still preeminent in those professions where it's basically a compendium of rules that we're working on. And then there are other fields, of course, fields like medicine, where precision for certain surgical procedures can be very important. And already machines are able to outperform humans. So we know that. And then we also know in things like chess and the Chinese game Go and so forth, we know the machines can outperform humans in these areas. So there are increasing areas where the machines can outperform us, and more of those areas are opening up, and more of those areas are being delivered on, if you like, by the machines. So I say in bullet point 4 that I think it is reasonable to expect that we will reach technological singularity within 3 decades, and we might get there more quickly. But I do think that institutional and other human barriers to change will. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 10 years, certainly. Progress, I think we always think it's one of those things that, you know, the singularity or whatever, it always feels at least 10 years away, and we've probably been saying that for at least 20 years. But anyway, I think we will. There's a point where we're going to get there. I think I'm relatively clear in my own mind that that's the case. And then I think, coming back to my introductory quote from Yeltsin, we have to manage the outcome such that we get a good outcome for humankind and not a negative outcome. And there are plenty of people, and I'm sure, well, I know we've spoken about this in previous London Futurists sessions. There are folks who've talked about the idea that machines could run away with things, and we will have some kind of self-reinforcing escalation of the superiority of machines. And how do we stop that? Are we just going to become like dogs and cats in the world? These are genuine challenges. So let's just think a little bit further. Go to the next slide, David, on economic possibilities for our children. There are some big challenges, and we talk about this thing being some decades away, and let's just drill into it a little bit more. This firstly is, how do you get from A to B? You can imagine in 3 decades time, or whatever it is, that basically machines can do most jobs that we see today. Let's assume that that's the case. But how do we get from A to B in a way which is even-handed, let's say, in a way which doesn't involve huge concentrations of economic power in certain companies? And then, of course, the big tech companies are not keen to give up their power, and they have all sorts of reasons and ways that they will retain a stranglehold on what they currently do. So to talk about the idea that the whole world has access to all of this superabundance which derives from machines being able to do everything, you have to think through how we're going to get there. How are we going to effectively, to put it, in point blank terms, how are we going to wrest control from the big tech companies? They obviously don't want that. And then I think you then start to scratch your head a little bit and say, well, let's just imagine that machines can do everything and humans can just sit on the beach having their gin and tonic or lemonade or whatever they want to drink. We need a new economic paradigm in order to think about that, I believe. And I haven't thought this through fully. I have started a book about it. At some point I'll finish it. But we need a new economic paradigm, which is not about cutthroat capitalism, but is more about some, let's say, some softer redistribution of wealth. Because if we could all be rich, what does it matter? We have to get past this relative needs point that Keynes touched on. But if we can all be wealthy, what does it matter? Why in particular would you need a board of directors sitting on all of that power and other people having whatever access they can get? So I think there's a big challenge about how we get from A to B. There is a big challenge about the economic paradigm which is implied by this situation of machines being able to do everything. But I do think this possibility of what I've called here super wealth and abundant leisure time, topics in which David has written extensively, I think it is real. We're a little bit away from it right now, but I think it is real, and I think it's something we do have to think about. In my think tank, by the way, just quickly, my think tank, as David introduced, is now called the Centre for AI and Prosperity. If you look on the invitation, you'll see it's called the Centre for Research into AI and Mankind. And after a bit of reflection and some prompting from others, we decided that wasn't a very good title, so we've gone for this shorter one. the whole point of my think tank is to try to get us to a good answer in 20 or 30 years' time. And I believe that the way to really think about this is to do what Keynes has done, think forward to what life might be like when we've solved the economic problem, and then back solve for what we think it means for we as a human race. How do we get ourselves into a position of contentment and happiness, and hopefully we avoid war, and we avoid all the stresses, I suppose, that we see today. I mean, if I look at the younger generation, it does feel like there's more stress in the world, and it why is this? We can reflect a little bit why it is, but it is the case, and people are talking about mental health problems more and more. We seem to be a long way from this idea of contentment with wealth and a world in which machines are supporting us to achieve that. So it is a bit of an interesting quandary that we find as if we observe it right now. Now, the last point I wanted to make on this slide, when we talk about economic possibilities for our children, I suppose up until a few years ago, I used to think the whole problem was about humans versus machines. And we now know that that is not really the case. And the likes of Elon Musk, but not only Elon Musk, are trying to figure out ways of how we can supercharge the human brain. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. We'll just don't move to the next slide just yet, David. But I think, so Neuralink, Elon Musk company, where he's got this brain filament implants, which he's already successfully implanted into pig brains, wants to do the same with us. He wants to become a cyborg, effectively, and he's not the only one. And does it mean all of a sudden that this humans versus machine problem goes away, and in fact what we're dealing with as ourselves as robots? This is a big question. Personally, I don't want to become a robot, but I know people who do. And there are lots of people who say, well, if I could be supercharged and I have a brain which works much more quickly and can do more things, why would I not want that? Well, let's go to the next slide, and we can think a little bit why one might not want that. So the human brain and infinite intelligence, what on earth am I talking about there? Well, it's very interesting that if you look at the super geniuses in history, and I put my favorite super genius, which is James Clerk Maxwell, first. I think probably the most underrated scientist of all time. But he, Edison, Einstein, Newton, they all talk about this thing, infinite intelligence. What is infinite intelligence? Now, if you read things like some of the things that Maxwell wrote, and indeed Edison, well, all of these folks, they all talked about it. And what do they mean? Somehow they mean the ability of humans to connect into the universe, and once you can do that, your intelligence in some way is infinite. And you may think this is all gobbledygook, but it is a fact that all of these folks talked about it, and they obviously experienced it. Edison said there's absolutely no doubt that this thing, infinite intelligence, exists. There's absolutely no doubt there is a superpower. Maxwell very interestingly talked about how one could partake with infinity. And what was he talking about? Same thing, infinite intelligence. Einstein also wrote about this. He said, if you think about the universe, there is something mysterious and powerful, and we can't quite divine what it is, but it is something powerful. And when he was often asked whether he was religious, he gave different answers at different points in his life. But I think what one can safely say, he was not conventionally religious. He was certainly not conventionally Jewish, and he was born into a Jewish family. But he definitely, when he talked about God, he says, what I mean is the power of nature. Right? I look at nature and I think there are all these amazing things. And how can they just happen? How can it be an accident? No, there must be some superpower out there. And he, along with Newton, Edison, Maxwell, they all talked about our ability to connect with this superpower somehow. One name I didn't mention on this list, and I did this workshop a couple of, well, say 10 days ago, and I spoke about somebody called Ramanujan, who's a famous Indian mathematician. If you've seen The Man Who Could See Infinity, you may know what I'm talking about. If you studied maths, you will certainly know the name Ramanujan. And in the film, there's a big kind of tension. So Ramanujan was an Indian gentleman who grew up with no particular education, but suddenly started just solving mathematical problems. And he started corresponding with professors at Cambridge, and they were very impressed because he was getting these solutions right. So at a certain point, they invited him to Cambridge. He became the first Indian to be a fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, where Newton was a fellow and is the college to study maths. And they always insisted, they said, look, you've got to write down, it's a bit like when you were doing your maths exams at school, that you must show your workings. And he said, well, you must show your workings. You can't just write down the solution. And he said, well, no. God tells me the answer and I write it down. Now, how could he do that? Had he somehow connected into the universe? I think it must be the case, because he just, as he said, God tells me what to do and tells me what the answer is, and I write it down. After he died, he left thousands of solutions to various mathematical problems. The vast majority was subsequently proven to be correct. Not absolutely everyone, but the vast majority were proved to be correct. So is there something about our brains which is more than a machine and will always be more than a machine? Well, these super geniuses thought so. And I think it's really interesting. Now, I want to give a little bit of a diversion into what I've called here super memorization and exercising the brain. 9 years ago, or almost to the day, and not because I particularly thought I would do well or anything, I entered the World Memory Championships. And it was more of an experiment to understand a little bit about the techniques for so-called super or competitive memorization. And it is very interesting, and I'll just talk a little bit about it because it is interesting. But the point I wanted to make when I was talking about this is that the person who co-founded those memory championships, a chap called Tony Buzan, some of you may be familiar with mind mapping. Tony Buzan was the creator of mind mapping. He also wrote various books on memorization techniques, on speed reading, all sorts of things. Very, very interesting man who sadly died, I think 3 or 4 years ago now, but a very, very interesting man and a truly original thinker. Now, in the World Memory Championships, there are 10 different disciplines, and it goes across 3 days, and it's actually pretty tiring, pretty intense. But just to give you a flavor of what the top people can do, the very last competition is something called speed cards. So the thing with speed cards is how fast, if you're given a deck of cards which are shuffled in no particular order, how long do you need to memorize that entire deck? Well, the answers are quite surprising. And the year I did it in 2013, the world record was 23 seconds. Today, as we speak, the world record is 14 seconds to memorize a whole deck of cards. So we've improved dramatically just in that period of time. The reason I entered the World Memory Championships, I'll just quickly mention the book that I read. I was watching BBC Breakfast one Saturday morning with the family, and this chap called Jonas came on. Jonas had just become the UK Open Memory Champion. He recommended a book called You Can Have an Amazing Memory by somebody called Dominic O'Brien, who had won the World Memory Championships no fewer than 8 times. And Jonas made the point, look, everybody can acquire a good memory. You just have to follow the process. And basically, it's a process of visualization. And you visualize certain things on a journey at different points on a journey which is familiar to you. And he was asked, well, you must have always had a good memory. And he said, no, not particularly. Bearing in mind, this guy now holds the world record for memorizing pi, which is the absolute astonishing figure of 101,000 digits. So he can recite 101,000 digits of pi without making a single mistake. It's mind-boggling. Now, the point of all of this, I'll come to the point. A lot of people are asking at this championships, why do you do this? What's the point? What is the point of memorizing decks of cards or random things? Tony Buzan's answer stayed with me, and I thought it was very insightful. He said, when you go into a gym and you watch somebody running on a treadmill but going nowhere, you know what they're doing. They're getting physically fit. Well, memorization is fitness training for the brain. The brain is a muscle, and the brain is the most complex thing in our known universe, in fact. And he said, we all should do this, because what we're doing right now, more and more, is outsourcing our brains to our smartphones. And that's not good. Our brains get lazier as a result. And so he felt that we should all take some time out of our smartphones. We should spend some time exercising our brain and treating it with the respect that perhaps we don't treat all the time. So that was his thing. And I think I'm very much, I suppose, a champion of this idea that our brain is something to be cherished, perhaps much more than we do at the moment. Perhaps we're too subservient to technology. Perhaps we can get more out of our own brains than we can. I will mention one, if you have the chance to watch, there's a Channel 4 documentary which came out about 15 years ago called The Boy with the Incredible Brain. And this chap, Daniel Tammet, has these superpowers. He had a seizure when he was 4 years old. He now has these superpowers. And in the show, they show how he can learn any language in 1 week. He holds the European record for pi, which is 22,000 digits. He can do this unbelievable mental arithmetic in his head very fast through a very curious way. He visualizes numbers as being shapes. Every number between 0 and 999 has an individual shape, and he manipulates these shapes. It's very strange what he's talking about. But interestingly, he believes that everybody has this ability to acquire a super brain, which just haven't quite worked out how to do it yet. So David, perhaps we just go to the last slide and a few concluding thoughts. I like this little quote from Rudyard Kipling. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what, why, when, how, where, and who. I won't talk about all of these things, but I think we're talking about the technological singularity. Why? Because it's just the relentless march of progress in the field of artificial intelligence and certain other fields. When? We don't know. But I think within 3 decades is a reasonable best guess. It might be faster than that, it might not be, we don't know, but I think that's the kind of horizon we're talking about. And when Keynes said, talking in 1930, he felt in 100 years' time it would be within sight. It's remarkable how, I think, pretty accurate, in fact, what he wrote. It's quite remarkable. How are we going to get there? Well, we've touched on this. It's this getting from A to B is a big, tricky thing. And the where and the who, these are also big questions. And we talked about, I touched on the idea of somehow wresting power from the big tech companies. And where is the technological singularity going to take place? Are we going to be a divided world? Will it be a world in which the haves and the have-nots are even further apart than they are today? And there is, of course, a big risk of that. So I think all these questions are things that I think we need to work on, and that's the purpose of my think tank. And I would encourage everybody to come to my monthly workshops where we debate these things. Perhaps towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about my upcoming conference. But I think these are big questions, and if we don't think about them, we may sleepwalk into a disaster if we're not careful. So on that note, I shall finish talking and perhaps we can open it up to the floor.
Many thanks, Hugh. You've given us a great deal to think about. There's the 6 questions at the very end, but there's all kinds of provocations beforehand.
Yes.
There's a little bit in the chat. There's quite a lot on YouTube as well. I'll try and feed some of that comments in. I'll start with one question that has officially been lodged because it's a good summary by PNJ, who confesses to not having read the paper in question, but he does want us to say what is the problem that Keynes is talking about. And maybe I'll say one thing first and then hand back to you, Hugh, as I love this paper as well. It's quite profound in many ways. The problem that Keynes talks about is, well, why do we keep on working so hard when we, in principle, shouldn't need to do so? And his worry in that paper isn't that we need to fight against big tech, nor is it that we're going to have to fight against capitalism, the way that some people say capitalism is reinforcing it, leads people to want more. Keynes is worried about what he called the old Adam. It's our human nature that we inherited from Neolithic times and has been bolstered by our struggles over the millennia, which led us to want to do better than others, which led us onto this acquisitive nature, which led us to value money. And Keynes's concern was that we would not be able to get out of that psychological bind, even though we have more technology at our disposal. Anything you want to add to that, Hugh?
I think that's a very good answer, David. I think you perfectly encapsulated it. I think that is exactly right. I mean, the sorts of questions that I was talking about were not points that were on Keynes's mind, but it was exactly as you just said it. I mean, and I think what is interesting, and he reflects on, it will be for the first time in thousands of years that humankind has actually been able to solve this economic problem, he believes.
Let me ask about this intuitions that you refer to, the super intelligent or infinite intelligence, the ability for people to apparently miraculously obtain formula. Like Ramanujan is a fascinating character, and I also recommend that film that you referred to because it was advised by mathematicians, lots of mathematicians who understood the actual history, understood the mathematics that Ramanujan was writing about, contributed to that. So it's not just that you get to see scenes of Cambridge, it's not just that there's lovely drama, but there is a fascinating window onto something that's hard for us to understand. And I think, Hugh, what you're saying is, if we're not careful, if we absorb AI and automation and mechanization, we're going to miss out on something. We're going to lose the ability that's in the human brain. So about this intuition thing, isn't it the case that people used to make the argument that games like chess and then Go in particular required a kind of intuition that could never be amenable to automation? And there's an interesting article in 2014 in Wired in which many of the Go players speculate that the way they operate is by a kind of intuition that's beyond any such algorithms. But then we have now artificial intuition, and that's one of the descriptions of how AlphaGo operates. It doesn't even fully understand how it operates itself, but it has these vast subconscious, the deep learning, and that prompts it to make various moves. And if you ask it, why did you make that move? All it can say is, well, these billions of parameters lead me to make these moves. So what else might be missing? What might be in the human brain that might be lost if we, in a naive way, try to augment our lives or supplement our lives or have our lives superseded with artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I think if I had to give you a single word as an answer, I would say the word imagination. Einstein talked about this. He famously talked about the fact that imagination is the most powerful thing that we have. It's far more useful to us and significant to us than just intelligence on its own. But imagination encircles the world, he said. I got the quote from Maxwell in front of me, and I'll just read this because it is an interesting insight. If I read it, you scratch your head a little bit, and you might want to read it over again and again. But this is what he said. So James Clerk Maxwell, I'm sure you know, but the man most responsible, ironically, the man most responsible for the smartphone, because he developed electromagnetic wave theory, amongst other things. I mean, the list of things that Maxwell achieved in his 48-year life is remarkable. But he says this, or said this: happy is the man who can recognize in the work of today a connected portion of the work of life and an embodiment of the work of eternity. The foundations of his confidence are unchangeable, for he has been made a partaker of infinity. Now you read that and you think, woof, what is he talking about? But he is actually talking about our ability to connect into the universe, I believe, in much the same way as these other folks did talk about. And I think it is our ability sometimes, or let's say the ability of some super geniuses, to create completely new ways of thinking about things. Take Maxwell. It is reasonable to say that he did more than any other single human being to figure out that science isn't just about what you can see, it's about what you cannot see. And you think about it, that is such a massive leap in our understanding of how the world works. His electromagnetic wave theory was obviously a very significant step towards our understanding of waves and waves propagating at the speed of light, and both electrical and magnetic waves doing that. How did he come up with this? How does one come up with an incredible insight like that? How did Einstein come up with relativity? These are things which require ginormous amounts of imagination. It's not like a problem that you can work on with billions of parameters. It is just a complete step change in how we think. And so I think that is the big thing, Dave, is imagination, I would say. But I mean, there's all sorts of answers to this question, but that would be my immediate answer.
So are you suggesting that there are kinds of innovation which is available to humans, some humans, or all humans with the right training, which is inaccessible to algorithms by themselves? Because after all, there was moves made, or a style of playing of chess and of Go by this Alpha Zero software, which caused humans to sit up and say, no move has been made like this ever in history. This is a new conception. So are you saying the AIs of the future won't be able to come up with a new mathematical formula? There won't be a new set of equations which somehow unify today's physics in a way that we humans have failed to do, but when we see it, we'll say, wow, these 5.5 dimensional quartics and bifurcations and some other, goodness knows, Calabi-Yau manifolds. This is a new way of conceiving which suddenly makes sense. You're not expecting that to happen, are you?
Well, this is, of course, a very, very interesting question. My view, I also do believe in some kind of infinite superpower. And my view is, if you can harness that somehow, and I believe these super geniuses did so, you will always be superior to any machine. But that is actually a belief. If you ask me to prove it, or to demonstrate it, or to rebut what you just said about the ability of machines to develop, they are able to develop new thinking, because they demonstrably have done that with chess and Go and so forth. Will a machine? So Stephen Hawking and Einstein and all these folks, they worked on trying to unify all these theories of the forces, the so-called theory of everything. Will a machine come up with the theory of everything? I'm not sure, but I don't know. Obviously one doesn't know. But I think that this thing, imagination, is not programmable in the same way as, say, a game of chess is, or Go, or whatever. I think the machines are very, very good at defined problems. But in order to crack the theory of everything, we have to realize there's another problem we haven't even thought about. And I think that might be the difference. That is our ability. Interestingly, if you read back about Maxwell, when he was lecturing at different universities. People said he was very interesting, but they found him quite difficult to listen to because his brain was fizzing with new ideas the whole time, and he would go off on these sidetracks. Now, he had some intuitive ability to generate new thinking and new insights. We don't know how he did it or what was his particular capacity to be able to do it, but he could do it, and he did do it. And we know that because he did so many new things in his life. Could a machine replicate James Clerk Maxwell or Einstein or Newton or Leonardo da Vinci? I think not, but I mean, as I say, it is a belief. It is a belief.
Because people used to say the same about Go playing, that Go playing was on a different plane, or that it wouldn't happen for a long time. That's 2014 article I mentioned in Wired, which summarized the views of large numbers of commentators at the time. They did not imagine that so much progress would be made.
Yeah.
And we've had the solution to a long outstanding problem of science. We haven't got the theory of everything, but we've got protein folding significantly advanced by another algorithm from DeepMind. So we should perhaps keep an open mind. Let's take a series of questions by Terry Raby, who is querying something that we said, which is that there's overpopulation or there's more population. Terry refers to analysis by a couple of people, Tupi and Pooley, that if you look from 1919 to 2019, that's 100 years, that the amount of hours of work needed to produce food is a 12th of what it used to be. So we are so much better at producing food. And so there is a significant progress. And so actually the carrying capacity of the Earth is arguably shot up over that period, rather than us being worried about a fourfold increase. So, I mean, have you given thought to that?
Not a great deal. I think the problem of population growth has been talked about over the centuries in the world of economics, and economists like Malthus going back several hundred years worried about it. There was some quite famous work done in the 1970s where people said, well, population growth is going to kill us. Of course, it hasn't. So I take the point that is being made. I think that we always somehow seem to find ways of managing whatever population we have. Of course, now we also have a situation where the likes of various billionaires want to set up colonies on Mars and maybe other places. And I think they see that as a plan B of some kind. I think when one talks about, the likes of, there are various people working in the field of longevity who want to live forever. I think once one starts talking about wanting to live forever, then that surely must create a problem. But we'll see. Will we get that? I don't know. But there are people who are quite a few people who really see it as their mission to live forever. But if everybody lives forever, well, it's not possible.
Why isn't it possible? If there is more possibility for the Earth to look after a larger population, and then in due course we have an enormous universe in which we could gradually expand. We could harness much more energy from the sun. We don't need particularly to terraform other planets. We can have huge space stations. This is part of Eric Drexler's original nanotechnology vision.
Look, David, I think that's right. I mean, if we confine ourselves just to Earth, then the problem becomes limiting. But if we say, well, actually, we've got the entirety of the universe to live in, so why would you do that? Yeah, I mean, maybe.
So we have a number of books being suggested in the chat. Gordon Silverman, he recommended Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World. That's by Jason Hickel. I think the argument there is that because we've been trying to increase GDP, we're having more and more adverse effects on the planet. Well, personally, I'm not a fan of degrowth as such. I think we can grow. We just need to ensure that it's green growth. And the green growth can include doing more with less. So it's a slightly different emphasis. So as we are more effective in our agriculture, and I include here switching to cultivating meat rather than having meat grown on animals, I think there is a future there with an abundance which can look after many more people with less impact on the planet.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said, David. I think it's actually fascinating to, I can see that comment, preferring to emphasize improvement, which I probably agree with as well. I think it is, we're bumping into some decisions and choices that we've not had to make before by virtue of this immense technological power that we are increasingly developing, and also the computer processing power as well. So we are beginning to see some questions which we've not had to think about, and we're having to think about them in very different ways compared to history.
Well, this comes back to your question, why? What are we actually trying to accomplish? So it's not economic growth for the sake of economic growth. It's the growth of human flourishing. It's the growth of the other aspect of life that Keynes referred to. And Keynes sort of implied we would be comfortable without growing, that we would have a particular standard of life, but I see no reason why we have to accept the level of happiness, the level of education, the level of health that was prevalent in, say, the upper classes in 1920, 1930. I think we can do a heck of a lot more than that. So what would you offer? I mean, your think tank has the word prosperity in its title now. What do you have in mind as prosperity? Is it GDP or is it something?
Well, I suppose I'll start by saying there is a I would say a controversial field in economics, which is all about trying to measure human happiness. And there are economists who've gone out there and tried to create happiness indices. And some people are enormously skeptical, but basically their starting point, and I think this is a valid starting point, if we just measure it by GDP or GDP per head of population, it doesn't take us too far, because we might all say in this country, GDP per head of population is dramatically higher than it was, say, 50 years ago, but are we any happier? And some people say, well, I'm not sure we are, I don't know. So you try to measure human contentment, whatever that is, and it is, of course, an intangible. But Keynes, when he talked about it, if you recall from his essay, he said, well, we need to get back to the traditional virtues of religion and the arts and these things. There's something softer that we need to get to have this sense of contentment. So I think that it's not just about money. It cannot ever be just about money. It has to be something else. It has to be something about, I think it has to be something about feeling that we have developed some, perhaps, that we're educated, that we understand things, we read broadly, we open ourselves up to a broad understanding of the human existence. Maybe it's religious, maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's something else, but it's not just money. I don't know, how. Obviously it's a ginormous topic, and maybe it's a topic for another discussion. What do we actually mean by all of this?
So money is a means rather than an end. Keynes was complaining about love of money, as opposed to practical acquisition of money in service of other tasks like prosperity, all-round flourishing.
I mean, somebody I know, something of a mentor to me, he's a life coach, and he, amongst other things, has coached various billionaires, and he often says, it is surprising just how miserable these super rich people sometimes are. So,
well, that takes us to mental health, because you flagged up that separate to the question of population growth, and I think there's good answers to questions of population growth, there are less good answers to the state of mental health. It's commonly said that there is more depression than before, more people are dying from suicide than before. Even the super wealthy are afflicted by mental illness. We go back to Voltaire, the French Enlightenment philosopher, who said the reason we need work is it saves us from three things. It saves us from boredom, from vice, and need. And if people aren't so involved in work or work that's fulfilling, maybe that's one reason why there's more mental distress. So what's your take on it? Is it just trendy to talk about mental unease, and we're probably a lot healthier than we used to be? Or do you see data or pick up indications that our mental health is generally a lot worse than in previous times?
Oh yeah, this is a minefield, and it's when you do your editing, David, this will be the area to make sure I didn't say something completely out of step, because it is a minefield. I think it is true that the broad data seems to indicate there is a much higher incidence of mental health of one kind or another, whether it's depression or something else.
Mental ill health.
Mental ill health. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about the younger generation especially, point to social media as being a problem, that this competitive need for having lots of likes seems to make some people, stressed out. I think it goes deeper than that myself. I think part of it might be, and this again, we're talking about all sorts of things here, and if what I'm about to say, some people say don't agree with you at all. Nutrition, I'm not so sure. If you look at, well, let me start, because this is an area of something I've really thought about. I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2019, and so I've spent an awful lot of time figuring out what does all of that mean, why did I have it, what do I have to do to manage it, and so forth. One of the things that you find out quite quickly when you dig into the field of nutrition is that highly processed carbohydrates, and especially highly processed carbohydrates, cause inflammation in our brains, in our internal organs, everything. And one of the reasons, and there are plenty of folks, you can find lots of papers on this, one of the reasons that we suffer from, that we have higher incidences of things like dementia and similar conditions, is because of the poor diets that we now follow, a diet based on something which is causing this inflammation in our brains. Sugar is basically a poison. It's not good for anybody, and highly processed versions of carbohydrates are not good for people at all. Some people say, well, there's good sugar and bad sugar, and that may be true. I don't know, but certainly things like crisps and French fries and all these things, it's difficult to say they are unreservedly good for anybody. But we have much more of it in our world, or certainly in modern society, in the Western world, than we ever did. And of course, that's driven by money, because the big food companies know that we're addicted to sugar, and they keep giving us more of it. I now follow a very low carbohydrate diet, and one of the things that allowed me to do was cut my use of insulin to a third of what it was before. Now, that's something that the pharmaceutical companies don't like. So we are in this world which is all about money, and certainly among the big companies, but yet I'm not sure that this pursuit of money is actually getting us to a good place. There's an interesting orthopedic surgeon somewhere in Australia who, if anybody comes in with achy knees or bad whatever, he says, right, I want you to go off carbohydrates for a month and come back in a month's time. And he says, in many cases, their conditions disappear. So we don't really, and we don't hear perhaps as much as we should about how bad poor nutrition is for us. And I can also say, I mean, as a type 1 diabetic, and I've been to various specialist diabetes units as part of the NHS, not a single specialist unit has ever told me to cut back, to step back from the carbohydrates. And yet, I think that is fundamental to how to manage this condition. I mean, diabetes is a condition which is about not being able to process sugar. Here's an idea: don't eat sugar. It's that simple. But I think that, as I say, coming back, I think highly processed carbohydrates are bad for everybody, and I think it is something to do with it. I'm not saying it's the only thing.
So we've got a number of hypotheses as to what might be responsible in part for the growing pandemic of mental ill health. There is the bad diet. other influences in our environment. Perhaps there is social media, which can exacerbate feelings of unworthiness or shortcomings. There is the theory of lack of meaningful work. But there's one more idea that's been put into a question by Mary Fee, which is, isn't it the sense of powerlessness that many people feel, that they are supposed to be able to participate in democratic discussions and help to sway the decisions made, but Mary says that lots of people feel that the power structures are stacked against them, that whatever resources there aren't being shared out fairly, and there's nothing much that can be done with it. So a dysfunctional democracy, or in some countries, autocrats, tyrannical leaders.
And look, I think that's a great point. If you look at studies of contentment in the workplace, one of the big things which has been proven time and time again that make people content or satisfied with their job is a sense of control over what they're doing. And if you haven't got that sense of control, you feel you're at the hands of some despotic manager or whatever, you feel unhappy. So that idea of sense of control, I think, is important. And Mary's obviously talking about the political side of things. And that is a problem. I remember shortly before Christmas last year, coming up out of Piccadilly Tube on the way to a bookshop, and there was a demonstration going on. So I stopped to say, what are you demonstrating about? And they were demonstrating about Julian Assange. And this young lady, who could have been no more than 25 or something, not that it's necessarily relevant, but I thought it was sad. She made this comment, but I think she was right. She said, we no longer live, we don't really live in a democratic society. Yes, at that time, Boris had been democratically elected, but once the politicians are in power, they behave as if they're in power, not in a democratic, necessarily in a democratic country or economy. And it felt like, and you know, all these things that went on during lockdown and Matt Hancock and all these things, it felt exactly like that. They were in power and they felt they could do what they want. And we don't really, we're powerless to really challenge it. You know, Julian Assange, all he ever did was fight for democratic freedom. But look what happened to him. So it's a good point. I think the sense of powerlessness we now have, even in the face of, you know, even in so-called Western democracies, doesn't feel quite as democratic as perhaps it used to. So
at that stage, let me feed in a comment from YouTube. There's somebody there called Murphy, who sort of complains that it's easy to talk, but what the world actually needs is action, hands on deck. So rather than just having a think tank, what are your actual recommendations for people doing things differently so that we can end up with the prosperity that's in the title of the think tank?
Yeah, well, that's a good challenge. But one of the things I do is I'm an ambassador for something called SOS Planet. And SOS Planet is a movement run by an Italian count, which purpose is to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. So we go out, try to convince people to do things differently. You know, you have countries like China says, yeah, we'll do carbon neutrality, but not until 2050. Well, we need to do better than that. It's not going to be good enough. By 2050, it may just be too late, as Greta Thunberg is wont to tell us. And I think she's right. The Earth is on fire. So that's one thing that I personally believe. I think it is an urgent problem. You know, in the world, because I had a background in accounting, they're now trying to set up consistent so-called international sustainability standards. It's the same organization that has run financial reporting. They're now trying to work on sustainability. And I'm not completely optimistic because it takes, on the financial reporting side, it's taken many, many years to produce certain standards, and we don't have many, many years to produce our sustainability standards. And I wrote a short article on LinkedIn some months ago now saying what we need now are fire extinguishers, not architects. And that's why I've signed up to this SOS Planet thing. I think, you know, I defend my think tank a little bit because I think what we're trying to do is generate new intellectual capital that will help address some of these things. Yeah, less than 7 years may well be right. It is of that order of magnitude. It is a big problem. So me personally, if you ask me what I'm doing apart from the think tank, is trying to work on the sustainability of planet Earth.
And does AI have things to contribute to sustainability?
Indeed it does, David. It's a great question, because now I can talk about my conference. I'm not sure you had that in mind, but I'll mention it briefly. So October the 19th, I'm running a conference called AI and ESG for Corporates 2022. And it's exactly this point we're trying to get at, which is AI can helpfully contribute to the sustainability of planet Earth. No question at all. And we're going to explore that in the conference. AI, some people have a view, and there's a chap called Mark Koppelberg. He's a professor at, I forget which, MIT, I think it might be, or it could be Stanford. Anyway, one of the big US universities.
Isn't it Vienna?
Oh, maybe it is now. Possibly. I'm not sure. Anyway, he has written that AI, it's like a double-sided coin, because yes, on the one hand, you can point to things that AI can helpfully do to improve the sustainability of planet Earth. However, AI is also a big factor of the programs of the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who want to disappear off to other planets, which he looks on less favorably. And he thinks AI, rather than far from being an enabler, might be a distractor. I mean, if you're going to go off and worry more about getting to Mars and saving planet Earth, maybe AI is not helpful, is one way to look at it. But for sure, AI can help us, and there are many things out there where AI can help optimize food production, can figure out all sorts of things that we used not to be able to figure out. Certainly in terms of prediction, our predictive capacity. You know, when are we going to get floods? When are we going to get, you know, what is the sunshine going to look like in 3 years' time? Our ability to forecast is far enhanced with AI and the data that goes with it, of course. So I think the answer to this question is AI can be very helpful, but we also have to bear in mind that it can possibly be something that will distract us in our work to help planet Earth. But anyway, I'll just quickly mention, and then I'll shut up about my conference, because this isn't a marketing pitch. Wednesday, the 19th of October, there are 4 modules on this conference. One module is for free. And then the other modules, there's a relatively modest payment if you want to sign into those. And by the way, you definitely should, because David's speaking. You all want to hear David speaking about the future of AI. So that'll be good. And actually, it's a great speaker lineup. We've got some really top-class people. For the London Futurists, the full price of the ticket outside the early bird, which is still running, the full price of a ticket for any subsequent module is £50. But for London Futurists, I'm offering it for £25. And you can attend 2 or more modules as you wish. And they are freestanding. So if you don't want to commit a whole day, which is completely understandable, then you can just sign up to 1 or 2 that might fit your program, or the ones that particularly interest you. We've got some interesting speakers, some interesting case studies, and we'll do, I think, similar to what David does. We'll also record it, and I'm also intending to write something, or there'll be some output, some written output of the conference as well. And post the conference, my monthly workshops, which I run out of my think tank, we'll be drilling into some of the areas which seem to be of most interest from the discussions we have on that day. So I certainly strongly recommend it, and you will want to listen to David, of course.
Well, we'll send round in the London Futurist newsletter shortly a summary of some of what you've just said about the agenda for the event and how people can get that discounted access. But if I can summarize what I think you're saying is that the combination of humans and AI together could come up with innovative solutions to sustainability, a real problem, an urgent problem, but the combinations might allow us to do more than mere humans by themselves could do. So that's a practical solution. But on YouTube and on chat, there is some nervousness about something else that you talked about earlier, Hugh. It's the discussion of an infinite superpower. And Terry is in the question and answers, wondering about this traditional religion and traditional values as well. And on YouTube, the question is, well, this just seems to be a cop-out. There is the suggestion that if we have such a belief, then somehow we imagine that things are going to be all right by themselves instead of actually getting involved to ensure things are all right. So do you want to say more about this, the role of an infinite superpower in your thinking?
I mean, it's an interesting point. I think I wouldn't see it as a cop-out. I absolutely believe we still do need to manage things. And that is the purpose of my think tank. What I'm trying to say is that our human brain can do perhaps more than we think it can. And I point as evidence on that to all the super geniuses who have lived, because they all say basically the same point. So I think, yes, we do have to manage things, and I don't, the fact that I set up my think tank is, I think, and I'm doing things like SOS Planet, I don't see myself as copping out, but what I'm trying to do is, I suppose,
what you're highlighting is that there are dimensions to human thinking that are often ignored and they're not explored, and we shouldn't just be banging our head against the wall trying to think the same as we've done already. There is access to radically innovative possibilities if we put our brain into the right mode, and that's the question. Somebody on YouTube is saying, where can I hear or read more on this? In chat, PNJ suggests a book called Ultra Learning by Scott Young, which PNJ says is interesting in the context of improving brain skills. You referred to books by Tony Buzan, the creator of many ideas on mental mapping and other brain skills. You've probably got a host of things that you might point people to in terms of accessing this often neglected superhuman dimension of the brain.
Yeah, there's an interesting article by a good friend of mine, Steve Simpson. Steve has a background as a medical doctor, but now he's a life coach. And he wrote an article on infinite intelligence. I think if you just put in Steve Simpson, infinite intelligence, you'll get the article immediately. It's pretty short, it's pretty punchy, but basically he summarizes what these great geniuses have said. And, the thing is that, are all we'll put it like this, can all these super geniuses be wrong? I doubt it.
Well, the question is whether they actually did say the same thing or whether it only sounds similar, because you can make anything sound similar if you don't listen too carefully.
Yeah.
So we should wind up in a few minutes. Let's come back to economics, because the title was Economics and Other Possibilities. One economic policy is UBI, Universal Basic Income. Mary in chat points out that one of the arguments in favor of universal basic income is to improve mental health, because if people are no longer anxious about where the next meal is coming from, if their basic needs at least are met, then people will stop worrying so much. And it has been said that poverty in this sense reduces our IQ because we're unable to concentrate. So do you have strong views on UBI? Is that part of the economic scenario of the future?
I think it probably is, David. I think I briefly mentioned I started a book on what the new economic paradigm might be. And I think it probably goes beyond universal basic income, but something, maybe universal income without the basic bit, that everybody gets something that is actually quite significant. If one really believes in superabundance, and I'm optimistic that is a realistic outcome, then yeah, I think it's part of it. Of course, you then got to set aside all these, Keynes was talking about the problem of relative needs. Some people always want to be and feel much richer than others. There will always people who pursue money for the sake of pursuing money. There are all these complications of being a human that are always going to be there. But basically, yeah, I do think UBI and maybe something beyond that is part of the answer.
Perry Raby in chat takes a slightly different view in saying the most important thing we can contribute to people is a sense of agency. And if people are taught that they are deprived, if people are taught that they are victims, it's very bad for them. So a key part of education, schooling, is this teaching about learning how to be, to an extent, autonomous. And so I think that's a different approach. I think it's not one or the other, but it is part of what you were saying earlier, is that there are dimensions to human accomplishment which, if we're not careful, we will lose by having the wrong attitudes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything you said, David. I think that's right. I think that's right.
Other fascinating comments in chat. One suggestion is that the risk we're talking about when we refer to complacency, it's better expressed as an optimism bias, that if we're too optimistic, we won't have the urgency to tackle matters. Terry restates that is the key risk is laziness, because we're not taking enough action quickly enough to address the shortcomings of our power systems, getting nuclear power reinstated, or improving food by taking more advantage of GMOs. So there's a rich discussion there, which we could let run for a long time, but I want to respect your time limit, Hugh. I'll give you a chance in a moment to raise some final thoughts, but I would like briefly myself just to look to the future. And when I say the future, I'm talking about the future of London Futurists. This is what we've been experiencing today with yourself as the chairman and founder of this new Centre for AI and Prosperity. If I wind forward 7 days, we will find another London Futurist meeting by a different kind of futurist, Michael Rogers. He calls himself a practical futurist, although all of us futurists like to think we are practical. He maps out in a fictional form, but a very interesting one, how if we did, he says, everything right, if we do a lot of things right for the next 60 years, how can we actually cope with the very serious problems that are in the world today? And he's going to reflect also on the importance of fiction, utopian fiction, as opposed to the dystopian fiction that often fills our minds and leaves us in a sense of victimhood and deprived and incompetent. So that's in 1 week's time. In 2 weeks' time, we're having a different analysis of how to deal with risks of runaway climate change. This is a view that takes a different economic perspective. This is a currency, no, nothing to do with cryptocurrency here. This is just an alternative currency proposed by quite a significant distinguished economist in his own right, Steve Keen, who has written books such as Debunking Economics, as you can see there. So he is going to be dialing in from somewhere in the Far East, I think Bangkok, and also sharing the stage with Adam Hardy, the director of EcoCore, looking at quite an interesting, innovative solution using some market and financial mechanisms to change how we are emitting too much carbon. In terms of action, I will point to something I've recently launched myself. It's called Future Surge. It's actually a rebranding or a renaming of what used to be called the Transhumanist UK Party. There's one of our slogans there. It's time to take back control of technology. And we talk about where do we operate. It's not at the level of telling people exponential surges can be wonderful. Lots of people are aware of that. Nor is it just pointing out potential bad consequences if exponential surges of technology are mismanaged. Nor is it even looking at what individuals and organizations can do to prepare for new business possibilities with exponential technology. Rather, it's working up here at the social and political landscape level, where many changes need to take place. This is partly about transforming how politics works. It's partly about setting different visions for the economic model, and it's partly about changing what is taught in school, in education, which leads me finally to refer quickly to our partner project, the Vital Syllabus. education fit for the new future, the skills that will make the biggest difference. Hugh, maybe I need to add in something here about this super intelligence, which probably isn't included anywhere here, so that's something to change. But this used to exist on the London Futurists website. It now has its own dedicated website, and it is gathering not just videos as before, it is gathering text commentary as well. So look out for an opportunity. If you've got material you think should be made available to everyone, then get in touch via some of the links that you'll find online. That takes us back to today's talk. We've already anticipated what's coming next for your think tank. Hugh, is there any final comments you'd like to make before we stop the recording?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I am optimistic about the future. I am also cautious about the future. And I take the point that was made that we can't cop out. We do have to proactively manage where we go, because we might otherwise sleepwalk into a disaster. But as I say, I like to be optimistic.
Well, that optimism must be based on a clear understanding of what actually is happening, what the true possibilities of extending human and augmenting human intelligence is, and what are the risks of technology not being back under control.
Yeah.
Well,
totally
thank
agree.
you very much. Thank you very much for leading us through this discussion. I know you've got to head off in a few minutes, so I will say thank you very much, Hugh. You've been a great provocateur and inspiration.
Very good. Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for coming and for engaging so positively. Very much appreciated.